Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Wednesdays with Watson podcast. I know that you could choose to do any number of things with your time, and I'm so honored that you chose to spend it with me. It is June of 2022, and it is not only Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Awareness Month, but it is the month that we will drop one episode every week versus every 2 weeks, and we will focus on childhood racial trauma as we look to observe Juneteenth. I got to be honest with you guys, I was shocked at the types of trauma in both the Black and Brown communities that those of us who are not part of that community could ever understand. These are things that are incredibly unique to their community, often not talked about, and even more rarely addressed, although it is my hope that projects like this will shed some light on this subject. Today we have a fellow podcaster and friend, Jen Uren of the This Mom Knows podcast. Jen is part of a unique but growing community in the United States in that she is the mom of 2 children that don't share her DNA and definitely don't share her lack of skin pigment. Today, she is here to tell us that story and share struggles with us that exist when a white family adopts Black or biracial children. She will be able to compare and contrast that experience with her biological white children. And so today I am honored to welcome Jen to the podcast. But wait, you know the drill. We are looking to grow this podcast mission. That mission is to provide access to help and hope through education. We have done that through therapists, blogs, stories of hope, most of all providing funds for pro bono counseling for those who can't afford it, and pointing people to the star of the story, who we believe is Jesus. We have awarded 2 scholarships for 2022. It is our hope that we can award about 6 more. If you would like to join that mission, just click that Contact Amy button in the show notes. While you're there, subscribe. And now, guys, here is my interview with my friend, Jen Uren. Welcome, Jen, to the Wednesdays with Watson podcast. This has been a long time coming, my friend.
Yes, I'm so excited to be here. It's like I've arrived.
Oh, no. And listen, I love interviewing podcasters for a multiplicity of reasons, especially you. You are one of the most... I'm going to ask you a question in a second that we're asking everybody on season 3, but you are one of the most resourceful, problem-solving organization people that I have ever met. And so I have very much been looking forward to this because I know that you will make this sometimes stressful, difficult job of being on this side of the mic a little bit better. But in season 3, so Jen, in season 3,
Okay.
we began by asking the first question to everybody, and I tell people I do that because I'm not a fan so much as to tell me where you were born, where you grew up, and I wanted to have an icebreaker question that also promoted our mission, which is stepping into our image bearer status, that Genesis 1:26, stepping into our image bearer status. And so this has been an incredibly fun question to ask, but the answers have been so enlightening to me because everyone has said, of all the questions you sent me, this was probably the most difficult one. And so as we begin the podcast and here in season 3, Jen, I would like you to tell me, what is your favorite thing about how God made you?
It's interesting because I didn't think about organization when I answered this. But I would say, I think it's the fact that I think God has given me eyes of empathy, and I'm not perfect at it, but I often find myself just really imagining what it's like to be in somebody else's shoes, like literally thinking if I was standing through their eyes right now. And what I have found is that has led me to compassion in a way that really makes it a lot more easy to remember that whoever it is, whether it's a homeless person I pass on the street, a short-tempered neighbor, or even one of my own kids, that they are created in the image of God. And, I need grace and compassion just the same.
Yeah, I love that. I love that about you. I agree with you on that. You and I have had some funny jokes, and this is a good opportunity for me to plug some Enneagram episodes that are earlier in the season. But we, just hearing you say that is a lot like how I'm built, and that is an Enneagram 2 that we call the helper. But Jen and I have had some funny conversations. She's like, I'm a 12 on the.
Yeah, I'm a perfect 10, actually.
You're a perfect 10. Oh, that's 10. Well, but I do agree with that. But you are incredibly organized, and man, do you love Jesus. And I love that God just melt your heart together. And we could have a whole podcast on the deep, deep relationship of Jesus. I had the opportunity to spend some time with you in Nashville at Pod Move last year, and it was one of my favorite things was hanging out with you and a couple of our podcasting friends. It's just, I got chills just thinking about it because of this medium, how much the Lord has just really given me in terms of friendships. And all my listeners are going to be like, Amy, all you do is interview your friends. Well, I have awesome friends. What can I say? But I do want to thank you for agreeing to be here with me today. Like I just said, we're friends in real life. But the story that you'll tell today, I don't really know. Like I've heard bits and pieces of it. Your podcast is called This Mom Knows Podcast. I have listened to it because I'm your friend, but because I'm no longer a mom, I don't listen to it often. But I've not heard the story that you're going to tell us today. And I do that on purpose because I want to have an authentic reaction, an authentic response, and then whatever the Lord allows, downloads, if you will, into my brain as a response to the questions that I ask my guests. I really believe that there's power in that for me. And so, as I mentioned, we are recording this at the very end of May, nothing like pushing it to the last minute, but the episode will drop in June of 2022. This month, we are focusing on racial trauma. So before we dive into that, though, people are wondering, well, Amy, why do you have another white person on your podcast talking about racial trauma? I asked you to do this today because you have two human beings living in your house that do not look like you, do not share your DNA, as I mentioned in the intro, and look quite a bit different than you. Now, you and I are, I believe, exactly the same age. And so I want to prime the listeners with this story when I tell you that you and I are the same age, and I celebrated my 50th anniversary, goodness gracious.
Of being born, anniversary of being born.
There you go, anniversary of being born in December. So listeners, keep this in mind as Jen tells us this story.
I'm actually a little bit older than you because I just turned 51. So
that's right. You just had a birthday.
Yes.
Well, tell us the story.
Well, it's a God thing completely. We had 3 kids and we were done for a variety of reasons. We'd had a late term miscarriage. I was very ill through all my pregnancies. And so we were essentially told no more, that very likely the next pregnancy I had, I would not survive it. And so we took steps and we were very content with our family of 3 kids. And then I thought I was pregnant. And that led to lots of what if conversations. And it got us thinking about what would life look like if we had a baby, how scary it could be, what would we do, just all these things. And then about 3 weeks into thinking maybe, we found out definitively I was not. And we went, bullet dodged. And I said, and I should just not say things, but I remember saying very clearly, well, if I could avoid the pregnancy and the newborn sleepless nights, I would be totally open to another baby. Off the cuff words, life goes on. And about a month later, everything changed when I was leaving our homeschool co-op, and a friend of mine flagged me down and she said, Jen, you've got a friend who's been waiting for an adoption placement, right? I said, yeah, I had a friend who'd been waiting for several years. And she said, I just found out about a little boy who is not yet in the system. He had an adoption fell through. And if he doesn't have a placement within a week, he's being put into foster care. And I had this, just this warm chill went up and down my back. It was this holy moment where I went, we found him a family. And I went home and I called my friend, and for a whole variety of really legitimate reasons, she had to say no. They were working through an adoption agency and things don't just change like that. And so my husband called on his way home from work and said, how was your day? And I'm like, well, let me tell you about my day, blah, 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 blah. And he says, what about us? I said, what do you mean, what about us? And he said, well, what about us? Could we adopt him? I said, I don't know. So I found out and I was told, yeah, it's completely private placement. So if the parents chose us, then yeah, we could do it. So we said, well, let's go until God closes a door. Never going to happen, right? And then the next day we found out, oh, wait, there's a baby sister and they don't want to separate them. And my husband said, it's never going to happen. It is such a long shot. And of course, we won't separate them. So let's just keep going until God closes the door. So we did. And 2 weeks from the day we found out about the little boy, we met with the birth parents and they signed over guardianship. And 6 months after that, the adoption was completely finalized. It was the fastest adoption I've ever heard of. And we had no idea what we were doing. We were just following until God closed the door, and he never did close the door. So we went almost overnight from 3 kids to 5, and our world turned upside down.
Wow. Okay, so let's back up just for a second. Tell our listeners, because again, I want some reference here. What were the ages of your 3 biological children at this time?
So at that point, they were 16, 14, and 8, I believe, or 16, 13, and 8. But 16, 13, and 8.
So, the 8-year-old might have been the only one that you didn't feel like killing at any given time during that point. Having a 16 and having an 18.
Yes.
So both of these children are not Caucasian. Is that correct?
Correct. But they are full siblings and
full siblings.
Full siblings.
Are they biracial?
Yeah. So one, a Black parent and a white parent. So yeah, they're mixed.
Okay. Which brings a whole other conversation into it. How old was the little boy when he came into your home?
He was 17 months old and the baby sister was 8 months old. They are only 9 months apart.
Wow. And I will tell you, just as someone who does a lot of research into trauma and to childhood trauma, and particularly as I've been focusing on this season, I am so grateful that you got them that young. Even now that the little boy would have had some of his experiences really maybe stunt, if you will, or affect him. But when you can get a newborn like that without bringing trauma into the situation, they're going to feel some of that later in terms of abandonment and stuff like that. But let's talk about that. So you bring these children into your home. How long ago was this?
So this was 5.5 years ago that they joined us, November of 2016.
So they are like in kindergarten and first grade, or first grade and second grade?
Yeah, so they're both in kindergarten. We actually held, our son has a summer birthday, so we held him back. So they're both kindergartners this year, but he'll be 7 in June, and she just turned 6.
Okay, gotcha. And to your knowledge, were there traumatic events in that home that necessitated that parent giving the child up? And can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So they both experienced trauma, but in different ways. Obviously they both had the trauma of simply being separated from birth mom. But our daughter was also a micro preemie. She was born at 24 weeks. She was 1 pound, 13 ounces. And so that's another trauma in and of itself. Because of some lifestyle choices, they never were really given they never went directly home, is our understanding, to their birth parents, because some things had to change there. So they weren't pulled, they just never went. In utero, they had exposure to different substances. So that's a trauma. And they each, before joining our family, they were with different homes that gave varying degrees of love and care and some neglect. And so that was another trauma. And just because of how, our adoption played out outside of the system, we don't have access to a lot of the files that would really help us understand the extent of the trauma that they experienced. So some of it we're just filling in pieces as we find them out, but there's a lot we just don't know. But one thing I'm very grateful for is that even in the absence of us, before we knew we would be there, God put people in their lives who did love on them. I've now gotten to meet all of her NICU nurses, and one of them said, I decided I was going to be her surrogate mother, and I would stay after hours and hold her and give her skin-to-skin contact and make sure she knew she was loved. And I mean, I would have done that if I'd known about her, but just to know that, people were loving on them in that way. And And many of these people have stayed involved in their lives. So, that has mitigated some more trauma because they weren't pulled and separated further. They've just shifted homes and they still have relationships.
Yeah. And I think that it's really important. And from the time I've known you, you've kind of identified, like, even though they were, and I didn't know, again, I didn't know they were toddlers when they came into your home.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot this season on the Wednesdays with Watson podcast about generational trauma and epigenetics. There is a graphic that, if I could figure out how to put in my show notes, and maybe you can help me do that, but there is a graphic that talks about epigenetics. And so let's talk about the birth mom for a second.
Yeah.
And she's pregnant with your daughter that you
Mhm.
adopted from her. Any trauma that she has experienced,
Yeah.
so not only affects her, but affects the baby, and then
Mhm.
affects your daughter's future babies. And so that is 3 generations of trauma that is coming into your home. And so even though they came into your home relatively early, what we don't understand yet fully, particularly about your son, is how much of the non-nurturing neglect trauma, and this is particularly prominent, I believe, in marginalized communities like Black and Brown communities, where they aren't getting the nutrients that they need for brain development. Whether we like it or not, Black and Brown communities have a higher incidence of drug abuse while pregnant. They have less access, some of them anyway, particularly in situations like this. I'm not stereotyping the Black and Brown communities, but if an adoption was necessitated, that meant there were some things missing for the development of that child.
Right.
And there's so much brain stuff that goes on. And I kind of just recently went through this myself, in that, because I don't know much about when I was a baby. And a couple pictures, like 3 or 4 pictures, surfaced with my mom holding me. And I find myself staring at that picture, like looking at the way she's holding me, looking at the look on her face, looking at my dad looking at me. And it's filled in some stuff for me that has helped me really figure out, why is my brain, why do I have PTSD, and that's significant, but I'm fairly intelligent. I did well in school. And so that brain development did not hamper for me, and looking at those pictures helped me understand that. And so those children coming into your home at such an early age, but your son in particular had 17 months where we don't know what he was, just the act of a hug, and like you said, that skin on skin contact and things like that, those things do cause trouble and issues later in life.
And we know a lot of it because he had a couple that cared for him his first 8 months of his life, and then the 3 or 4 months before we got him. And so they've become grandma and grandpa to all of our kids, and we're still very much involved with them. But there's a gap of time in the middle where we don't have a lot of details about. So we know some things, but not all things.
Right. And unfortunately, as he gets older, he's going to want to know more things, and and all of that. So let's talk about, because I do want to know if you as a white family who have adopted biracial children are experiencing trauma because of that. And then I would also, so I'm going to ask you a couple questions, but my first one, I'm going to go for the juggler.
Okay.
Is, what is your greatest fear and concern for them in today's world? So, and again, this series really is highlighting trauma that is unique to marginalized communities or Black and Brown communities, women, anybody that is not, traditionally been taken care of very well. Let's put it to you that way. We're going to talk about maybe some of the trauma that they are experiencing that's unique to the community, but I would like to know what your biggest fear for them moving forward into this world, as it pertains to racial trauma.
Yeah. Well, really, my biggest fear for them is that they're going to not feel like they belong anywhere, that they're not going to feel they fit in, in the Black community or in the white community, that they're not going to feel like they totally fit into our family because they weren't born into it. They're not going to feel like they fit into their birth family. And so really, it's like, I've seen so many adopted kids, even as adults, just say, I don't fit in. And I think that sense of belonging it does come from being confident not only in, who you are, but whose you are. And so we do spend a lot of time really trying to talk with our kids about, who we are in Jesus, who loves them. We go through this long list of all the people who love them. And we just want them to really feel that they belong because of who they are, not because of how they look and what the group reflects, if that makes sense.
1,000 makes percent. It makes 1,000% makes sense. My best friend has 2 biracial children, and one of them is a boy and one of them is a girl. And that is one of, and that's what those are one of the things that we call little T traumas. Like, they're going out into the world and you're not white enough for the white community. You're not black enough for the black community. So who are you? Yeah. And so I think that fear is super founded. And then, at the onset, talking about how they are precious daughter and son of the Most High God. Mm-hmm. That being said, they do bring in a different culture than you're used to, and that you raised your other 3 children. Are you guys intentional about raising them inside their heritage?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one that we've had to wrestle through. And so this is a little bit of a longer answer, but at the time of their adoption, our next door neighbors and our dear friends were a Haitian family, and mom and dad had lived in Haiti during their formative years, and their daughters never had. And so I began to kind of observe, even before the adoption, that there was a distinct difference between their culture and their heritage. And so the culture that mom and dad experienced and grew up in is vastly different from the culture that the girls experienced living in the States. And they would never have the same cultural experience. But they had a shared heritage, one that they often invited us to experience as well, which was really cool. So by the way, if you're ever invited for New Year's Day to a Haitian family, because that's their Independence Day, the tradition is to eat this soup joumou, which I'm saying wrong, all day long, and it is delicious. So do it if you can. Yeah, but I noticed this this difference. And so it was a little bit, so that was just an interesting thing that we would think about a lot. And so when the adoption came along, we started thinking about the difference between culture and heritage. And our kids' ethnic background is Caribbean. So it's not African. It's just different even there. But another thing was, that because everything unfolded in our adoption so fast, we didn't have preparation that a lot of other families do. We didn't go through courses and training. We didn't do a lot of stuff. We just jumped in. And for me, that was a blessing, because if I'd had expectations and they weren't met, it would have frustrated me. So with no expectations, I just went with the flow, which I'm not a go with the flow person. So that was pretty amazing. So I jumped into a whole bunch of adoption groups for white families with Black kids. I started asking questions, and I was not prepared for the hate within these groups. It was really bad. I was told things like I had a moral obligation to move to a predominantly Black neighborhood so my kids wouldn't be tainted by my whiteness. And if I said, well, what about my older kids? I was told they're white. They don't count. I pressed further, and I was basically told that the color of my kids' skin should determine how I raised them, which that bothered me. Another time I was talking about the secondary trauma that our older kids had experienced and the losses that we had to grieve as a family, even through the joy of these babies. And I was asked, well, what loss could we have possibly experienced? And I went with a short list, and I was told, I never once considered a white woman could experience loss. Like, I'm a person, right? And I found a lot of this really, really troubling, because it felt like it muddied the waters of race and ethnicity instead of making anything clearer. So I felt like I was being encouraged to either be a racist parent, judging and treating my kids differently because of their skin color, or I needed to apologize for who God had made me to be as a white woman. And it just didn't feel biblical to me. And then I found a group called the Center for Biblical Unity. And that has been an amazing resource for navigating life as a multi-ethnic family. I don't feel like I need to apologize for being who I am. I don't feel like I need to apologize for who my kids are. We definitely have to make some changes. We are not naive to reality. We know that they're viewed differently because their skin is brown and ours is white. We recently moved to Indiana, and we were very aware to make sure we did not move somewhere where they wouldn't see people like them. We have been so blessed by a community here with families that look like ours, white parents and Black kids, but also kids that look like them. Lots of families with one white parent, one Black parent. And so by being surrounded by and building these relationships with families, we have a community where we can ask the hard questions, seek out advice, see things with empathy, and not feel gross for being who we are and answering God's call. And I know you'd mentioned in the questions you sent me about hair, and I have to tell you, I had so much to learn about doing their hair. I asked a lot of questions, and of course, being task oriented, I always was asking, how long does that take? How long should I allow? And I was being just really practical because I didn't want to be, okay, we leave the house in 10 minutes. Oh, this is going to take an hour. I wanted to make sure I could, fit it into the routine. And I remember one very kind woman messaged me and she said, I noticed that you keep asking about time, which I understand because, you don't want a lengthy process to start when you can't finish it. But she said, instead of looking at their hair as a task, I would encourage you to look at it as relational. It's time you spend with your child. It's tender. It's a time to connect. And that really changed a lot of my approach, not just to their hair, but to lots of things. And I think it really focuses on the heart of what the whole issue is, and that's relationship.
Yeah, and the whole person, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot to unpack there. First of all,
Yeah.
I want to thank you for addressing the hate that you as a white family receive because you are a multi ethnic family. That's a real thing. I spent a lot of time on the Clubhouse app, as my listeners know, and I am in quite a few groups there where I literally am the only person who is not Black or brown. And I've been in rooms where that community does somewhat feel offended and I'm not speaking for the entire community, but it is a thing. There is hate on white families. And I think that it comes from, and this is just totally my opinion, but I think it comes from this idea that maybe in the past, or not maybe, in the past, people who are not Black and brown have this savior complex. Right. And I think that sometimes when Black and brown communities see white families adopt children who are biracial or Black, regardless of from where that heritage came from. And I think that's an important component too that I want to unpack in just a second. And so I'm really glad that you articulated that, because it is my hope that I will have some people who feel like that, like, why aren't we letting Black families adopt Black kids? The reality is because we don't have enough families to adopt any kids, regardless of race, creed, sexual orientation, any of that. And so no one is going to turn down a home that is loving, that is a loving environment for a child who has been either neglected or abandoned or given up at birth because their mom loved their child more than they did them. And so I really, really appreciate you bringing that up. The second thing I wanted to bring up, because my question when I asked you is, are you raising them in as if they are Black and or biracial? And again, I did not know what your answer to that question is. And I think that drawing that line, that delineation between culture and heritage is really, really important. Heritage is important. Their Caribbean heritage is important. You're a homeschool mom. I have taught in the past, and I can guarantee you that I would be teaching them everything I can. I think of Lisa Harper, who adopted little Missy from Haiti, and she was very, very, very diligent about making sure that they were immersed in their heritage. She takes them back to Haiti, and look, who doesn't want to go to the Caribbean? So hopefully down the road. But yeah, immersing them in their heritage, very different than culture, right? Yeah. So you brought up the hair analogy, and the episode should air before yours, where I asked two women who are of the Black and brown community, tell me a trauma that has happened that happened to you that wouldn't happen to me. And both of them said hair trauma, and they talked about things from having their scalp burned to kids yelling and screaming them at school and picking on them and calling their hair nappy and wanting to touch their hair and all of the things. And so when we bring culture into it, and especially when we bring culture into a home like yours, what an amazing opportunity to do a both and, right? Like we are made in the image of God. We are Genesis 1:26. We are literally made in the image of God, regardless of how much melanin we have in our skin. But back to the heritage thing, we were a fool to say, I don't see color, because we do see color. And so in your home, I'm so happy to hear you delineate between heritage and culture so that you can raise these children as who they really are, is the image bearer of the Most High God, right?
Yeah.
And on their way to heaven because of the completed work of Jesus on the cross. And so thank you for adding both of those in there. As we are talking about that this evening, I'm going to have an interview with TJ McKnight. Again, the part of the purposes of this series is to talk about trauma that happens to Black and brown communities that don't happen to us. And who better to tell me that than somebody who raised 3 white children and now is raising 2 biracial children. So can you speak to this at all? Maybe give us a couple of examples that you're comfortable with your kids hearing 10 years down the road.
Sure.
So that my listeners, who are probably predominantly white, to be honest with you, can say, oh my word, I never thought about a child enduring that trauma. And we're not talking, when I'm talking to you, and I don't know about TJ, but when I'm talking to you, they're inside a solid family unit, right? So sometimes some of the interviews my people will hear in this series, they were not raised in good homes. They have high adverse childhood experiences scores, but this is a loving home with 2 parents who love Jesus and who love them, but they still experience trauma that white boys and white girls don't. And let's go so far as to say they probably experience trauma that Black boys and Black girls don't, because they're biracial. So could you help my listeners understand just a couple of examples, whatever you're comfortable in giving, of trauma that your children experience, your younger 2, that the 3 that your older 3 would not have, because simply of the melanin in their skin?
Yeah. So I think it's hard, again, because I'm the white mom, so I don't know fully how they experience it, but I do know some of the differences between these guys and our older kids are just walking out in public. We had the conversation the other day that because our younger 2 are mixed, I can walk comfortably with them most places in public on my own, and people just assume I'm married to a Black man. And my husband says the same thing. It's when we're together with the kids that we get the funnier looks. I never had to think about that with my older kids because they look like me. When we're places and making eye contact with people, it's interesting to see who will make eye contact with me when I'm with my older kids only versus when I am with the younger kids. I've noticed that there are white people who just really won't engage, and whether that's racially motivated or personality, I can't really say. But I also noticed that Black people are far more likely to engage with me when I'm with my younger 2 kids than when I'm with my older kids. So, it gets noticed. Even being able to tell them how to be safe. I mean, we know the reality is that when they are going to be out and about, they're going to have to behave a little better than white kids, because they'll be the ones that are singled out first because of their skin. So teaching them, be respectful, be kind, be cautious, be aware. I never had to teach my older kids about that. And then, of course, when you go somewhere, we joke because I'm a picture person. I love having pictures. And so we go, oh, look, they're going to be the only Black kids here. That means they'll be in all the pictures. So I won't have to worry about taking any because, of course, they want to represent diversity. But sometimes that's true. They're the poster children for diversity in a group, depending on, how many white kids are there versus them. So those are things that I think will become, they're not evident to them yet because they're still so little, but they're starting to be. But then there's also there's the adoption trauma of, I have 2 moms. Yeah. And 2 dads. Yep. And not all kids do. I remember when my youngest daughter asked my oldest daughter, who's your birth mom? And my oldest said, Mom's my birth mom. And I could see this little hurt in her face going, so I have 2 moms, but you just have one. And so there's all those things, and that's not racially, but that's a difference I've seen between, the older 3 and the younger 2. So
it's a rejection trauma.
Yeah.
Even though you guys love them well. And like you said, it's not connected racially, but what concerns me about Black and brown children and moving forward in this country who because life is already hard, right? And they hit the jackpot by being adopted. But I can tell you, after being removed from my own mom and not growing up in my house and not knowing my dad, that at 50 years old, there's still stuff that I struggle with, and rejection is one of them. If somebody even in the vein of rejects me, so let's say your little boy is on the kickball field and he gets picked last, that pain is going to be a little bit more, not because of the color of his skin, even though that's what this series is about, but because he had been rejected. Yeah. Many kids can find their way through, and we're going to talk about counseling here in just a minute, through it. But the bottom line is we are wired to have our identity and our DNA here on earth. But more important than any of that, and what I really appreciate about you, because I know you, is this is your identity in Christ. And yes, we have to be careful about these things when you go out into public, particularly your son. I really hope, Jen, that 10 years from now when he's driving, that you don't have to instruct him to put his hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2 and to, not make any fast moves or any of those things. I also hope that, and again, I know you well enough to know that as you raise them, you are giving them both the good and the bad. Look, this is where we are in our country. And we thought that we were past this, but clearly the last couple of years has demonstrated to us how not past this we really are. And that there are people out there that, will judge them based on the color of their skin. And that in and itself is another rejection trauma. And I think indicative of being adopted. Do you see any of that play out now in either one of them, that you could connect to the adoption and or the rejection or the color of their skin?
No, and let me tell you, I want to tell you something that we did. My husband, this was his wisdom. I think it was brilliant, but it was very important to the birth parents that we sign an agreement, an open adoption agreement. And the state we adopted in, they're not legally enforceable, but you can sign them. And so our lawyer sent over a document. My husband looked at it. He said, we're not doing this. And he rewrote the whole thing as a love letter to the 2 children from the 4 parents. And so we promise this, we ask you, it is the most, it still brings me to tears. It's the most beautiful thing.
I 1000% got
and chills. We are in regular contact with both birth parents. We recognize in many ways we have a platinum package when it comes to this. And so they will struggle with rejection and questions and those things. But we have worked very hard to build a strong foundation that's built on you were placed and not taken. You were loved and not rejected. We've tried really hard. And other than that one moment where I saw that pain in her eyes of, I have 2 moms, we haven't really had a lot of those issues because they know all four of us, and they know we all love them.
I can't stress to you enough how important that is to continue.
Yeah.
Even if the birth parents get into, and I don't know what precipitated the adoption. It sounds like there were some drugs involved, and I think your older son, may exhibit some behaviors later down the road, and you might already as a result of that, if that supposition is correct. But I can't encourage you enough to do that, because they already have enough working against them, having been,
Right.
you know what I'm saying? Like, it's very difficult for me to sit in front of this microphone, in front of, a bunch of equipment, and be as well educated as I am and all the things, and say that stuff still doesn't bother me. But
Right.
it does, but it does, right? Because I'm a human being. And so you guys keeping them with their human identity there with their birth parents, I think, is so important. And then you're really just coupling that with something that I love so much, because we talk about 3 C's on this podcast. One of them is community, which you have so eloquently talked to us about, and this is what you've done with those birth parents, is community. But the other is counseling. Has that been a part of your story at all, in terms of this journey, and will it continue to be if it is?
Yes. Now, counseling is expensive, and we are self-employed, so we don't have insurance, and that covers it. And we struggled for many years to find a place that, self-pay. I was like, that's still not affordable. So we had to sort of sidestep formal counseling for a few years and engage in some trauma support groups instead, where it was a little bit more lay-led. But we just kept searching, and moving here to Indiana, we found a place that was affordable, and it's been amazing for us. And we wanted to make sure that we did counseling, not only so that each of us in our family could have I'll call it a neutral perspective, someone who could be a little more objective about things and help us through it, but also to normalize it, because we have good reason to believe that down the road we are going to need it with our kids. And by making it part of our normal now, when we have a crisis, we're now not introducing a new thing as well. And so our hope is that it will make it just so much easier and more natural when we really, really need it. So I know it's not always an option, but I think particularly with the adopting kids of another race, I think if it's something that can be there, especially if they're a trauma-informed counselor, it's really, really useful to just make it part of life.
Yeah. And useful doesn't, everybody that's listened to my podcast knows that I believe that counseling is life. And so what you just said is exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm doing about approximately 185,000 things at the moment, this podcast being one of them. And the reason why I'm continuing the podcast, among many, is to raise money and to award scholarships for people that need counseling that can't afford it. And we just awarded our second one. And so listeners, again, as I said at the beginning of the show, if you're interested in joining us in that, because Jen is so right, access to counseling changes it. Access to counseling changed my life. It probably even saved my life. And so it is my goal. When I turn 50 years old, and I don't know whether I've actually said this publicly or not, but when I turned 50 years old, I said to the Lord, I want to raise $1 million by the time I die for pro bono counseling. Now, we got approximately $999,000 to go before we do that. But but it just is something that's super important to me, because I believe that I wouldn't be here where I am today had I not had community, which we've talked about here today, counseling, which I'm still in, and then the third C is church. I would love to know how your church, so you just moved to Indiana, so you may not be able to speak for your church now, but I know that you were, I think anyway, that you were pretty involved in your church. Were you near in the Chicagoland area?
Yeah.
Talk to us about how your church supported you in this endeavor as you guys continued down that road.
Yeah, our church in Chicagoland was amazing. We started going there when our oldest was 3 months old, and we moved in November, so it was almost 21 years we were there. And so when this happened, um, it was a small church, and when we had the adoption, they simply said, "Send a link to an Amazon wish list," because we had nothing, and suddenly we needed everything, pretty much overnight. And they provided us with meals. They provided us with all the things we needed. They did a diaper baby shower for us. I didn't have to buy diapers for a year because they gave us so many. So they really surrounded us in some very practical and tangible ways. So we felt that love and support. Um, and the church was really close to a seminary. So we had a lot of international cultural diversity at the church because of that. And so that was good. So our kids, even in the small church, they were playing with, little girls from Africa and, kids from India and all this. So that was a really neat thing as well. But that was something that, we looked for in our new church when we moved, was still that diversity. And we've been really thankful. We jumped right into a church. This is the great thing about COVID, is that so many churches went to online services that we were able to church shop before we moved here, so we could just jump right in once we got here. And we found an amazing church, and they had just started pre-COVID an adoption and trauma support group that we found out about. And so we've been able to jump right in with great support here. And we're grateful, because I don't take that for granted.
Everywhere.
That does not happen everywhere. But if it's not already something that's offered, sometimes the solutions come because we have a need. So start it. Yeah.
Amen. That you and I are on lockstep when it comes to that. That's why I started this podcast. There was nothing authentic on mental health. There was nothing authentic on PTSD, and so I started it without even thinking about it. And so the church is so important. I know my church does this amazing thing, and they've done for probably a decade now. But they partnered with a foster care agency in the area, and that foster care agency comes and teaches classes at the church, and families take those classes, get certified by the state of Florida, bring in these foster care children, and many of them have been adopted because of that. And so, again, I can't stress the importance of the 3 C's. This is episode 64, 65, community, church, counseling, and most importantly, and this is going to be such a Captain Obvious question, but it is one I try to ask on every single episode, is that Jesus is the star of my story. Is he the star of your story?
Yeah, 100%. And, you had mentioned this earlier. This isn't a story of rescue where we swept in as white parents saving Black babies.
Right.
It's a story of redemption. It's how God used losses of our own to prepare our hearts, how families are being restored, even though they don't look traditional, and how God loves each and every one of us because he made us. And it's not our circumstances, our choices, our achievements. He's the only reason that we had the courage, the energy, the support to even say yes without hesitation. And circling back to my age, my friends have grandkids and I have children. So let me tell you, it's exhausting.
And that, I think, is going to happen to you at some point. You'll be both a grandmother and, because if you're 18-year-old 5 years ago, I'm doing that math, that's right. 22 or 23. And so, I think you're going to share that duality title, if you will, which is hilarious. You don't look like a grandma for sure. Well, here's the thing. I love to give the microphone, especially to podcasters, at the end of the show. Do you have any advice for other families who have, and you've given a ton of advice, but anything that we haven't already mentioned here, advice for families who have adopted outside of their race?
Yeah, I would say be a good listener, but pray for discernment in the voices and the messages that you choose to let take root. Always, always hold it up to the filter of scripture so that you can instill truth and not just what's popular.
Right. Philippians 4:8 is one of my favorite filters
Yeah.
on that. Just if you pretend like the thoughts and the way you love your children and the way you do your life, you're sifting shells at the beach and only the good stuff comes through. When there's 8 of those in Philippians 4:8, good, right,
Mhm.
noble, praiseworthy, good report. If there be any virtue, there be any praise, think on these things. I think that's such great, great advice. Well, you're truly one of my
Yeah.
heroes as someone who did grow up in the foster care system. Now, I
Mhm.
did get fortunate and I didn't get put in the actual official foster care system, but I was in foster
Mhm.
care. But I can tell you that those children are going to know that they are so loved because of what you did for them. And I can't help but think of a song, because you just mentioned it just now, about how we just need to obey and we just need to do what we're called to do, regardless of what that looks like, regardless of how old we are, or how crazy it is, or how any other things. But there's a song by Maverick City called Gyra, and there's a lyric in that song that says, "You, I've never been more loved than I am right now. It
Mhm.
doesn't take a trophy to make you proud, because I've never been more loved than I am right now." And
Mhm.
if I were raising adoptive children, that would be, especially in a community that is not mine, I would think that that is so primary to say you are loved because you exist. You are not loved because of your beautiful tones, skin tone, your intelligence,
Yeah.
and your talents, anything. You are loved by the God of the universe, who allows me to love you with an unconditional love. And there's nothing you can do. Even Jesus, before before he had performed a single miracle, was baptized, and the Father said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." And
Yeah.
so when we're talking about raising children in the home, they need to know of this unconditional love. And unfortunately, or fortunately, you get to lavish a little bit more of that on kids who do not look like you, and who, like you said, are going down the road, need some a little bit extra help as it compares to your biological children. And so,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, one more thing. I want you to tell us about your ministry, your podcast, and where
Mhm.
people can find you.
Thanks. So my podcast kind of comes out of the fact that I have so many different interests, and it feels like, some days I'm all over the place, but at the heart of all of it is really connection, connecting people in new relationships, or connecting people to ideas, connecting them to the tools and the gadgets that will save their lives, because I love gadgets. Um, so my podcast is based on connecting, and it's called This Mom Knows. And it's really built on the idea that as moms, we have got it all covered. Together, we know it all. What this mom knows, that mom doesn't. What that mom knows, this mom hasn't learned yet. So we don't have to stress out about figuring it out when we can go to our mom team for help. So my podcast interviews moms about the things they know so other moms can learn from them. And thismomknows.com is my website. Thismomknows.com/podcast is where you'll find my episodes.
And I will link all of that in the show notes. Guys, Jen Uren is the real deal. She loves Jesus and she loves your Watson. And so I thank you for being here today, Jen. I think that this episode is going to be really helpful for families out there, and even for people in the Black and brown communities who do feel like we're trying to be a savior complex by adopting children, when in fact I'm staring, and this will go up on YouTube as probably one of our first video interviews, and so people can see your heart and see the sincerity and who you are. And I opened this podcast by asking you what one of your favorite things God made about you was, and you said, "I am empathetic." I have no doubt that that empathy is exactly what drove you and your husband, whose name is
Jim.
You and Jim, to take on these children. And so I am grateful for people like you who are mitigating what could be a life in prison, or a life on the streets, or a life with needles in their arms, and all the things, because all of our communities are struggling with those things. But these two children need to just continually be taught that their identity is in Christ, and 1 Peter 2:9, the chosen race, a royal priesthood, who has called us out of darkness into marvelous light. And so thank you so much for being here today with us.
Well, thank you, Amy. I just love you, and I love what you're doing with this.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Okay. All right, guys. Well, We will be back next week with another episode on racial trauma as we flip through the month of June. Make sure you hit that contact Jen button and the contact notes that will allow you to subscribe to her podcast, as well as the plethora of information that she provides on social media. And so, Jen, I want to say to you the same thing I say to everybody. I never leave the microphone without saying this in the end of the podcast. And I want you to know this, and I want you today sometime to tell all 5 of your kids these 5 things. You are seen, you are known, you are heard, you are loved, and you are valued. Thank you so much. God will see you back in June.